This is a historical narration, not a record of exact dates, but a story about how systems quietly formed and why we still live inside them. These episodes are not about empires or rulers, but about the choices that made permanence unavoidable, and how staying in one place reshaped human life. For most of human existence, leaving was safety. Movement allowed people to escape scarcity, conflict, and exhaustion. When land was depleted, groups moved. When tension rose, separation restored balance. Staying in one place for too long was dangerous. But slowly, conditions began to change. Certain locations offered repeated advantage. Reliable water, fertile land, or predictable animal movement made return more efficient than departure. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. Memory replaced exploration. This episode begins at the moment when returning became preferable to leaving, not because humans wanted permanence, but because movement began to carry its own risks. Staying was no longer a mistake, it was becoming a strategy. And once people stayed, systems had to follow. Before permanent settlement, human life remained flexible. Groups moved in response to environment rather than design. Shelter was temporary. Possessions were limited. Space was shared without ownership because no one remained long enough to claim it. Social structure reflected this movement. Leadership was situational. Authority appeared when needed and disappeared when circumstances changed. No one governed permanently because no one stayed permanently. Decisions were negotiated in proximity and dissolved when the group separated. Conflict was managed through distance. Scarcity was managed through movement. Memory was managed through people, not places. This flexibility shaped behavior. People learned to adapt quickly. Cooperation mattered, but dependency was limited. If relationships failed, separation remained possible. If resources diminished, relocation restored balance. Time was experienced through cycles rather than accumulation. There was no need to preserve decisions beyond immediate relevance. The future was approached cautiously because conditions rarely stayed the same, but flexibility had limits. As populations slowly increased, movement became more complex. Familiar routes grew crowded. Preferred locations were revisited more often. Encounters between groups became unavoidable. Some places stopped being temporary. When groups returned repeatedly to the same locations, familiarity grew. Knowledge of land deepened. Patterns of use emerged. What had once been open space began to feel occupied. Still, nothing was owned. Still, nothing was fixed. But the option to leave was becoming harder. The moment return replaced departure. Life began to change. As groups returned to the same places more frequently, pressure began to build. What had once been open land became familiar territory. Paths repeated. Campsites were reused. Certain locations gained importance because they were known, reliable, and shared. Familiarity reduced uncertainty, but it also reduced options. When multiple groups relied on the same space, separation became difficult. Crowding increased. Resources that once felt abundant now required coordination. Disputes lingered because the people involved did not leave. Memory followed conflict forward. A disagreement from one season could resurface in the next. Repetition changed behavior. People began to notice who arrived first, who stayed longer, and who used more. Informal sharing, once sufficient, began to fail under strain. What worked when groups were small became unstable when they grew. Pressure did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as friction. Friction appeared in daily routines. Gathering areas became contested. Storage sites needed protection. Access to water, shelter, and food required agreement. Movement, once the solution to conflict, became costly. Leaving meant abandoning knowledge, familiarity, and accumulated advantage. Staying felt safer, but it required compromise. This was the tension at the heart of early settlement. The environment had not changed, human presence had, and once pressure appeared, life could no longer rely on flexibility alone. Organization emerged not as a plan, but as a response. As people stayed longer in the same places, they began to coordinate behavior to reduce friction. Tasks repeated. Responsibilities stabilized. Routines formed because routines lowered conflict. Storage became necessary. When food or resources could be kept, decisions had to be made about access and use. Storage introduced time into survival. It connected the present to the future. Once resources carried forward, they had to be protected, measured, and shared deliberately. Boundaries appeared before they were built. Space began to feel divided, even without markers. Certain areas were used for specific purposes. Movement within a settlement became patterned. Repetition turned use into expectation. Organization also shaped time. Days became structured by shared activity. Seasons mattered more because planning became possible. Decisions were no longer made only for the moment. They were made to preserve stability. This shift was profound. Life no longer reset each day. Actions carried forward. Memory mattered. Choices accumulated consequences. Coordination reduced uncertainty, but it also reduced freedom. Individual behavior became visible. Deviation affected others. The group began to expect consistency. Organization allowed more people to live together, but it required limits to do so. And once limits existed, they needed to be maintained. As organization stabilized daily life, authority followed. Someone had to decide how stored resources were used. Someone had to resolve disputes that could not be escaped through movement. Someone had to enforce agreements when cooperation failed. Authority did not begin as power. It began as necessity. At first, authority was situational. Individuals with experience, trust, or skill stepped in when decisions mattered. Their influence lasted only as long as the situation required. But permanence changed this. When people stayed, authority could not disappear with the moment. Decisions affected future stability. Consistency became valuable. Authority roles became repeated. Over time, expectations formed. People learned who decided. They learned who enforced. They learned who mediated. Authority became recognizable. Once recognizable, it became durable. Decisions carried weight beyond immediate presence. Rules were remembered. Behavior was shaped even when authority figures were absent. This was a critical shift. In mobile life, authority dissolved with distance. In settled life, authority remained. Compliance was no longer optional. It became expected. Authority reduced conflict, but it also narrowed choice. It protected organization, but it limited flexibility. The system began to govern behavior rather than respond to it. This was not tyranny. It was structure learning how to stay. And once authority took hold, life inside settlement could not return to what it had been. Once settlement stabilized, structure began to feel natural. What started as coordination slowly became expectation. Routines that reduced conflict became habits. Habits repeated long enough stopped feeling chosen and started feeling normal. This is how organization becomes culture. Culture is not written at first. It is learned by observation. Children grow up watching how space is used, how food is shared, how disputes are resolved. They learn where they belong by seeing how others behave. The system teaches without instruction. In settled life, behavior is no longer temporary. People wake up in the same place. They perform similar tasks day after day. Over time, repetition shapes identity. A person becomes known not just by who they are, but by what they do, where they live, and how they fit into the system. This is when roles solidify. Tasks that were once flexible become expected. Responsibilities repeat. Authority becomes familiar. Over time, these roles are inherited rather than negotiated. The next generation does not choose the structure. It is born into it. Tradition forms at this point. Practices that once solved problems become defended simply because they exist. Their original purpose fades, but their presence remains. Stability becomes more valuable than adaptation. Change begins to feel dangerous, even when conditions shift. Culture also protects structure. People begin to enforce norms on one another. Approval and disapproval replace constant authority. Behavior is shaped through expectation rather than command. The system becomes self-maintaining. This is one of the most important transitions in human history. Systems no longer need to be rebuilt each day. They reproduce themselves. Belonging becomes conditional. To belong is to follow the rules. To break expectations is to risk exclusion. Culture makes compliance feel moral rather than practical. People defend the system not only because it works, but because it defines who they are. Memory plays a new role. In mobile life, memory faded with movement. In settled life, memory accumulates. Stories are told about how things have always been done. The past becomes justification. Continuity becomes proof of correctness. This is how permanence takes hold. The settlement no longer exists simply to meet needs. It exists to preserve itself. Structure becomes identity. Identity resists disruption. What began as survival has become a way of life. And once structure becomes culture, it becomes very difficult to leave. Modern life is built on this moment. Cities, institutions, borders and laws all trace back to the decision to stay. We live inside structures that exist because permanence once solved a problem and then learned how to reproduce itself. We inherit systems already in place. We do not choose where roads go. We do not question why authority exists. We accept routines as normal because they were present before us. Settlement taught humans how to live with continuity. It also taught humans how to accept constraint. The benefits are clear. Stability allows growth, coordination allows scale, memory allows progress. But the cost remains. Once staying became normal, leaving stopped being simple. This episode is not about ancient villages. It is about the foundation of modern life. Because the decision to remain changed what it meant to be human. This was not the end of movement, it was the beginning of permanence. And once systems form, they rarely disappear.